The wind that swept through Dry Creek carried the scent of dust and fading hope. The sun hung low over the endless Wyoming plains, turning the sky a bruised shade of amber as townsfolk drifted in and out of the only general store for 50 miles. Inside, the creak of the wooden floorboards echoed every quiet step, every hesitant sigh, every coin that clinked on the counter. Clara Jennings stood at the back of the line, her bonnet tilted low to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She clutched a small coin purse in her trembling hand, the kind that used to be heavy with ranch earnings back when her husband was alive. Now it was nearly empty. 3 coins, not even enough for flour and beans together. The storekeeper, Mr. Hobbs, was a hard man with eyes like cold river stones. He glanced her way as she stepped forward and set her meager coins on the counter, voice barely more than a whisper. "Just a bit of sugar and cornmeal, please." But Mr. Hobbs didn't move. "You still owe from last month, Clara," he said flatly. The words carried across the room and the chatter of others slowed. "No more credit." Her cheeks burned. She stammered something about paying soon, about the next harvest, though she knew there would be no harvest this year. Drought had taken it all. Mr. Hobbs simply swept the coins back across the counter. "Not until your debt's cleared," he said, turning to the next customer as if she were invisible. Clara gathered her coins, fingers shaking as she tucked them back into her worn purse. Behind her, laughter stirred among a group of ranch hands, rough men who leaned against the shelves like they owned the place. "Guess even the widow's luck's run dry," one of them muttered. The words sliced through her pride like barbed wire. She didn't look back, didn't speak, just turned and walked out the door into the late-day light, her faded skirt brushing the dust. She thought she'd made it a few steps down the porch before she heard the boots behind her. Slow, measured, carrying weight that wasn't cruel. "Miss Jennings," a voice said, deep and low. She turned, hand instinctively clutching her shawl closer. It was Luke Carver, the cowboy most folks whispered about. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a reputation for keeping to himself. He wasn't known for smiling nor for meddling in anyone's troubles. Yet here he was, standing close enough that she could see the faint scar that cut along his jawline, the dust coating his hat from a long ride. Clara tried to speak, but her voice came out in a whisper. "Please don't," she started, thinking he might pity her, that he'd offer charity she couldn't bear to take. But Luke only nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Come with me," he said quietly, almost as if afraid someone else might hear. "I'll fill your table tonight." The words hit her harder than she expected. No one had spoken to her with kindness in months, not since her husband's death, not since the neighbors had grown tired of helping a widow who had nothing left to give in return. She opened her mouth to protest, to say she didn't need anyone's help, but the warmth in Luke's gaze stopped her. It wasn't pity. It was something gentler, something that felt dangerously close to understanding. "You don't have to," she managed. "I know," he said simply, tipping his hat. "But I want to." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The town's dust swirled between them, golden and soft in the dying light. Then Luke stepped off the porch and untied his horse, a strong bay mare with a white blaze down her nose. "You can ride," he said, holding out his hand. Clara hesitated. Her heart thudded in her chest like it hadn't in years, the kind of wild, frightened rhythm that came from remembering she was still alive. When she finally placed her gloved hand in his, it was calloused and warm, steady as the earth itself. He helped her into the saddle, climbed up behind her, and guided the horse away from the murmuring stares of the town. The sun dipped low, painting their shadows long across the dirt road. They rode in silence for a time, the prairie stretching wide and endless before them. Clara didn't ask where he was taking her. She didn't need to. The way he guided the reins, careful and sure, made her feel safe for the first time in a long while. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and horses, the faint crackle of grass beneath hooves. She wanted to ask him why he cared, why he'd noticed her at all. But something in his quiet told her the answer wasn't simple. Maybe he'd known loss too. Maybe he saw a reflection of it in her eyes. When the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Luke slowed the horse and nodded toward a small cabin nestled against the foot of the hills. Smoke rose from its chimney. "That's mine," he said softly. "Ain't much, but it's warm." Clara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat too heavy to speak around. She should have said no. She should have thanked him and gone back to her empty house with its cold hearth and silence that screamed. But instead she nodded. Something about the promise in his words, "I'll fill your table tonight," broke through the walls she'd built around her heart. And so she stayed silent as he helped her down from the horse and led her toward the cabin, unaware that this one evening would change the course of both their lives forever, and leave them both haunted long after the fire burned low. The cabin was small, built from rough-hewn logs and the stubbornness of a man who preferred solitude over company. A lantern flickered in the window, its glow spilling soft gold against the darkening dusk. When Luke opened the door, warmth poured out, not just from the fire crackling inside but from the smell of food, simple and honest, stew simmering on the stove, bread cooling on the table. Clara hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting around the tidy room. It was a bachelor's space, plain but cared for, a rifle over the mantel, boots lying neatly near the wall, and a single rocking chair that looked worn smooth by long nights of silence. "Sit," Luke said gently, hanging his hat on a peg. She obeyed, though it felt strange to be waited on. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls, the aroma filling the air with something close to comfort. When he set one in front of her, she caught herself staring at his hand, the roughness of them, the quiet steadiness. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft scrape of spoons and the wind outside brushing against the shutters. Clara hadn't eaten all day, but now every bite came slow, deliberate, her throat thick with unspoken gratitude. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured at last, eyes fixed on the steam rising from her bowl. Luke shrugged, still looking at the fire. "Ain't right what happened back there," he said. "Town's got long memories and short hearts." His tone wasn't angry, but there was something deep in it, something that sounded like he'd seen the same cruelty before. "They're just trying to survive," she said softly. "So am I." Luke glanced at her then, and for the first time she saw a trace of pain flicker in his eyes. "We all are," he replied. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Outside, coyotes howled across the plains, their cries echoing the loneliness that had followed them both for years. Luke stood and poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one before her. "You got kin anywhere?" he asked. She shook her head. "Had a brother in Kansas. Last I heard, he joined the railroad. Never came back." Her voice trembled. "After my husband passed, I tried to keep the ranch going. But the drought came and the cattle died one by one. I sold the land piece by piece until there was nothing left to sell." She let out a shaky laugh that held no humor. "Now I can't even buy cornmeal." Luke leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "Life don't fight fair," he said. His voice was low, almost tender. "But you fight back anyway." Something inside her broke at that, not in pain but in recognition. For so long she'd been seen as a burden, a poor widow scraping by on memory and dust. But Luke spoke to her like she was still whole, like she hadn't been beaten down by loss. The firelight danced over his face, softening the hard lines, catching the faint shadow of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She wondered what story lay behind that look, what ghosts haunted him when the night stretched too long. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What are you fighting?" He paused, jaw tightening. For a heartbeat she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Myself." The word hung in the air like smoke. She didn't press further, though curiosity sparked in her chest. There was a loneliness about him she recognized, the kind that settled deep and refused to leave. After a while, Luke rose and fetched a small wooden box from a shelf. He opened it, revealing a few precious things: a folded photograph, a silver chain, and a carved wooden horse no bigger than her palm. "My ma carved this for me when I was a boy," he said, handing it to her. "Told me it'd remind me to keep running, no matter how rough the trail." Clara traced the tiny figure with her thumb, touched by the gentleness hidden behind his gruff manner. "Did you?" she asked. "Keep running?" He smiled faintly. "For a while, till I found there ain't nowhere left to run." The fire popped, scattering sparks across the stone hearth. They both watched them fade, the silence between them softening like a shared secret. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that burns quick and bright. But it was something stronger, understanding. The kind that grows quietly between two souls who've both been broken and learned how to keep breathing anyway. When the dishes were cleared, Luke fetched a blanket from a chest and spread it near the fire. "You can rest here," he said. "Floor's warm enough." Clara hesitated. And you? I'll take the porch, he replied. Ain't the first cold night I've had. She opened her mouth to protest, but he only gave a small shake of his head and stepped outside before she could argue. When she lay down beneath the blanket, the warmth of the fire pressed close, and for the first time in months she didn't feel afraid. Through the cracks in the shutters she could see Luke sitting on the porch, hat tipped low, the glow of his pipe ember against the dark. He looked like a man carved from patience and sorrow, one who carried his own storms in silence. Something inside her whispered that she should stay, that maybe this man who had filled her table tonight might someday fill the emptiness inside her, too. She closed her eyes and the sounds of the prairie lulled her to sleep. The sighing wind, the distant cry of an owl, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of his boots shifting on the porch boards, keeping quiet watch. She dreamed of her husband's face fading into the dust, of a table laid with food and laughter, and of a stranger's voice saying gently, "Come with me." When dawn broke pale and cold, she woke to find a note resting by her hand written in a rough, unfamiliar script. Went to town. Don't worry none. You'll eat again tonight. She held the paper close, her chest tightening with something dangerously close to hope, the kind that can heal or destroy depending on what the next sunset brings. Morning light spilled across the cabin floor, thin and pale as a whisper. Clara sat by the window clutching the note Luke had left, her thumb brushing over the rough paper as though it might warm her. Outside, frost glistened on the grass and the hills wore a quiet stillness that seemed to belong only to souls too weary for words. She had half a mind to leave, to walk back to town, to whatever scraps of pride she still possessed, but something in her wouldn't move. She looked around the cabin, at the small fire Luke had left burning, at the bread covered neatly with a cloth to keep it warm. Everything here carried his quiet care. Every small detail spoke of a man who did not talk much but meant what little he said. I'll fill your table tonight. That promise hung in the air like prayer smoke, fragile and glowing. She tied her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp scent of morning pine. The world out here was different from town, open and honest without eyes to judge her. For a long time she simply stood there watching the horizon, waiting for a dust trail that might mean he was coming back. It was near midday when she saw him, a dark figure on horseback cutting across the plain. Luke rode with his hat low against the wind, saddlebag heavy on his hip. The closer he came, the more her heart quickened. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more. But when he swung down from the saddle and looked at her with that same calm steadiness, something deep inside her ached. "You're up early," he said, voice low and warm. "Couldn't sleep much," she admitted, smiling faintly. The bed was too soft. He chuckled, a small quiet sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. From the saddlebag he pulled out a few wrapped parcels and set them on the porch rail. "Got flour, beans, some jerky," he said. "Even found sugar. Thought you might like that for your coffee." Clara blinked, surprise flooding her. "You shouldn't have spent—" But he cut her off with a look that said he didn't need thanks. "You'd do the same if it were me," he murmured. She wanted to tell him she wouldn't, that she had nothing left to give, but instead she whispered, "Maybe I would." They cooked together that afternoon, moving around the cabin in a rhythm that felt almost like memory. She kneaded dough while he chopped wood, the two of them filling the quiet with small talk that meant more than it seemed. He told her about the ranch he once worked, a place that burned down after the war, taking half the men with it. She listened, realizing that loss spoke the same language no matter whose heart it lived in. "Is that why you live out here alone?" she asked gently. Luke nodded. "Town folks talk too much," he said. "Out here the only thing judging you is the wind." She smiled softly. "And the coyotes." He grinned then, a fleeting, honest grin that made him look younger, less burdened. She found herself laughing, a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in too long. For a moment it felt like the world had forgotten to hurt. As the day wore on, they took the horse down to the stream, gathering water in pails. The air smelled of sage and wet earth, and the sun brushed gold against the hills. Clara rolled her sleeves, kneeling beside the water, her reflection wavering in the ripples. Luke watched her for a long moment before saying, almost to himself, "You look better with the light on you." She froze, startled by the softness in his tone. "I'm sure that's just the sunlight playing tricks," she said, half laughing, half nervous. "No," he replied quietly. "It's not the light. The words hung there, tender and dangerous, stirring something in her that she'd long since buried. She wanted to turn away, but when she met his eyes, the world seemed to still. For one breathless heartbeat, everything, the loss, the silence, the years of emptiness, disappeared. Then he looked down, busying himself with the pails. "We best get back before it cools," he muttered. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the handles, betraying what his voice would not. That night they ate together again, stew and fresh bread, laughter soft as the fire's glow. Clara found herself talking more than she meant to, telling him about her late husband, about the first time she came west as a girl. Luke listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable but kind. "He must have been a good man," Luke said quietly when she paused. "He was," she whispered, "but life's not kind to good men." Luke looked into the fire for a long while before answering. "No," he said at last, "it ain't." A silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. When she finally looked up, she caught him watching her, and for a moment she wondered if she'd ever been seen so clearly before. When the meal was done, Luke stood and reached for his coat. "Storm's coming tonight," he said. "You best stay inside," she frowned. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I've weathered worse." Before she could argue, thunder rolled across the sky, distant but growing. Lightning flashed along the ridge. "No," she said firmly, surprising them both. "You're staying here. I won't have you sleeping in the rain." He studied her for a moment, his jaw set like a man unaccustomed to being told what to do. Then with a small nod, he relented. "All right," he said, "but I'll take the floor." The storm broke soon after, a wild, relentless roar that shook the walls. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the cracks. Clara sat near the fire, heart pounding, while Luke tended to the flames. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and without thinking she reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers instantly, strong and sure. They stayed that way, silent still, the world outside raging while inside a fragile peace grew between them. In that moment neither spoke of love or loss or the ache that lived beneath their ribs. But they both felt it, that quiet, dangerous pull that made the air too thin, the fire too warm. When the storm finally passed, they sat long after the flames had dimmed. Luke's hand lingered over hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles like a question he didn't dare ask. She didn't pull away. Somewhere deep inside she knew the answer already. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper and the prairie slept again. In the silence that followed, something shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. Dawn came slow after the storm, washing the land in silver mist. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, the kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. Clara woke first, wrapped in the blanket near the fire. Her hand brushed the empty spot beside her, and for a moment she thought Luke had gone. But then she saw him outside, hat off, head bowed against the rising light. He stood by the fence line, his shoulders still, as if he were carved from the same stone as the hills. She watched him quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. Something had changed last night, something quiet and tender that couldn't be spoken aloud. It lingered in every look, every small motion. The memory of his hand around hers still burned soft and steady, like an ember that refused to die. When she stepped outside, he turned slightly, eyes tired but warm. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, rough from the chill. She smiled faintly. "You didn't sleep." He shrugged. "Didn't need to. The air's good after rain." He handed her a mug of coffee, steam curling into the cool dawn. They stood side by side, looking out over the plains where mist gathered in the hollows like ghosts. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Luke nodded. "Ain't much, but it's honest. World don't lie when it looks like this." She looked at him then, really looked, at the lines carved into his face, the scar that caught the light along his jaw, the sorrow that lived deep in his eyes. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't the only one haunted by the past. "Luke," she said softly, "what happened to you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his mug down and leaned against the post, jaw tightening. "You ever do something you couldn't take back?" he asked finally. She hesitated. Yes, she said, her voice a whisper. I let my husband ride out in a storm once, even though I knew it was too dangerous. He never came home. Luke's eyes flickered with pain, but he didn't look away. Then you'll understand, he said quietly. There was a man, years back. We were ranch hands together. He stole from the boss, tried to pin it on me. When the truth came out, he drew first. I shot faster. His voice trembled just slightly. It was him or me, but his brother didn't see it that way. He swore he'd find me. Clara felt her stomach tighten. And did he? Luke nodded once. He's been close. Heard tell he's working out of Dry Creek now. Been watching that store. Clara's heart sank. The day you found me there? Yeah, he said. I saw him. The words hit like a blow. She stepped back, the air between them suddenly heavy. Then you shouldn't have helped me, she whispered. If he's after you... Clara. He took a slow step toward her, voice low, steady. I ain't sorry. I saw you in that store and I couldn't just walk away. His gaze held hers with quiet force. If trouble's comin', I'd rather face it here than keep running. She wanted to tell him it wasn't worth the risk, that she'd survived this long alone and could do it again, but the lie caught in her throat, because deep down, she knew she didn't want to face another sunrise without him in it. The day passed heavy and slow. They worked the small garden behind the cabin, trying to pretend that danger wasn't riding closer with every gust of wind. Luke repaired the fence. Clara hung washed linens in the sun. But beneath every small task, fear hummed, low and steady. Around midday, a lone rider appeared on the ridge, distant but unmistakable. Luke froze when he saw the glint of a rifle. Inside, he murmured. Clara obeyed without argument, heart hammering. Through the window, she watched him walk to his horse, untie the reins, and mount up. His movements were calm, deliberate, the way men move when they've already made peace with what comes next. She wanted to scream for him not to go, but something in his posture, the quiet resolve, the stillness, silenced her. He rode toward the ridge, dust rising around his horse's hooves. The rider dismounted as Luke approached. Even from the distance, Clara could see their gestures. Sharp, tense, words like knives thrown across the wind. Then the flash of steel. A gunshot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley. Clara gasped, hand flying to her mouth. A second shot followed. Then silence. The kind that presses on your ears until you can't breathe. She ran from the cabin before she could think, skirts tangling around her legs, heart slamming in her chest. The world blurred, hills, grass, sky, until she reached the rise. Luke stood there, breathing hard, his revolver hanging loose in his hand. A man lay motionless a few yards away, face hidden in the grass. Clara stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. Luke turned toward her, his shirt torn, blood dark on his sleeve. It's done, he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes, those gray eyes that had held such quiet kindness, were full of sorrow. He gave me no choice. She looked from him to the body, to the gun still smoking faintly in his hand, and felt tears sting her eyes. You'll have to leave, she said. They'll come looking. Luke nodded. I know. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the rain still clinging to his coat. But I couldn't run this time. She wanted to touch him, to hold on to him, to tell him she didn't care about the law or the whispers of townsfolk. But the words tangled in her chest. Where will you go? She managed. North, maybe, he said. Over the ridge. There's land there, open and quiet. Could start over. His gaze softened. You could come. The offer broke her heart wide open. She wanted to say yes. God, she wanted to. But behind him lay the body of a man whose death would follow them both. If I go, she whispered, they'll call me a fugitive too. Luke nodded slowly, the truth settling heavy between them. Then I'll go alone. He reached out and touched her face. just once, fingers brushing away the tear that slipped down her cheek. "You made me remember what it's like to feel human again," he said softly. "Don't forget that, Clara. Don't forget you still got a heart worth keeping." Her breath caught, and before she could stop herself, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and trembling, tasting of salt and rain and everything they'd both lost. When it ended, they stood forehead to forehead, neither speaking. Then Luke stepped back, mounted his horse, and turned toward the north. The wind caught his coat, carrying dust and silence in his wake. Clara watched him ride until he disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by distance and sky. The world felt empty again. But this emptiness was different. It was full of the echo of his voice, the warmth of his hands, the ache of what might have been. Behind her, the cabin still smoked from the morning fire, its doorway open like a waiting heart. She stood there until the sun dipped low, and the first chill of evening crept across the plain. Somewhere out there, she knew he was riding alone, carrying her memory like a scar. And she whispered into the wind, "Come with me," though she knew he could never hear her again. The days that followed were quiet, each one stretching longer than the last. Clara returned to her little cabin, but it no longer felt like home, at least not the way it had when Luke had shared it, filling the hearth and her heart with warmth she hadn't thought possible. She tended the small garden, swept the floor, and boiled water for coffee, but each routine task reminded her of his absence. The mornings were the hardest. She would wake to the sun spilling across the floor, expecting to see his broad shoulders silhouetted against the doorway, only to find emptiness, and yet she carried the memory of him like a secret ember, glowing in her chest and keeping her alive, even as sorrow shadowed every thought. Weeks passed, and word came from town that the man Luke had confronted had left Dry Creek, leaving behind whispers and speculation. Clara felt a hollow relief. He was safe, and she hoped. And yet the knowledge offered no comfort, for the man who had changed her life even for a short while was gone forever. She walked the plains every evening, retracing the paths they had ridden together, imagining the feel of his hand brushing hers, the sound of his quiet voice telling her she was seen, she was worthy, she was alive. Some nights the wind carried faint echoes, whispers she could swear were his words telling her to keep her heart open, to remember what it had been to feel human. She clung to those moments even knowing they were just shadows of what had been, as fragile as the smoke curling from her chimney. Months rolled by, each season changing the hills around her. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers in spring, shone golden under the harsh summer sun, and turned russet in the cool autumn winds. Clara worked tirelessly, keeping her cabin and garden alive, learning again the rhythm of life without him. But the ache remained, a soft, persistent thrum at the back of her ribs like a heartbeat that belonged to someone else. When she set the table for herself each night, she always placed an extra cup at the far end as if he might return, as if the promise he had whispered in the dust of Dry Creek could still find its way home. She never spoke of him to anyone. Some wounds, she had learned, were meant to be carried in silence. One late autumn evening, the sky bruised with the colors of sunset, she saw a lone rider on the ridge. Her heart skipped, breath catching like it had that first day Luke had helped her from the store. She ran to the hilltop, squinting through the dying light. The figure was familiar, tall, broad, riding with the same deliberate calm she remembered. Could it be him? Hope surged, wild and trembling, only to be crushed as the rider continued across the ridge and disappeared behind a fold in the hills. It wasn't Luke. The emptiness settled back into her chest, heavier this time, accompanied by a quiet ache she knew would never fully leave. She sank to the ground, the wind tugging at her hair, the prairie stretching endlessly around her, vast and unyielding. That night she lit a single candle by the window, letting its small flame dance against the glass. She thought of Luke often, imagining him wherever the winds carried him, imagining that somehow he remembered her as she remembered him, the warmth of her hand, the quiet laughter, the night when the storm had raged and yet they had shared a fragile peace. She wrote letters she never sent, pressing her words into paper with a trembling hand, letting them drift into the night as if the wind could carry them to him. She could not change the past, could not bring him back, could not undo the pain that life had thrown in their paths, but she could remember. She could honor what he had given her, even if only for a fleeting moment. Years later, the cabin still stood, weathered and worn like she had grown to be. Clara, older now, sat by the same hearth where they had shared their first supper together. Outside, the plains stretched wide, endless and untamed, much like the love that had touched her and then slipped away. She pressed her hand to the table, imagining the strength of his grasp, the warmth of his presence. And though the world had moved on, though seasons had passed and life had demanded she endure alone, a soft smile tugged at her lips. She whispered into the quiet, "I'll keep the table ready, Luke. Always." And somewhere across the plains, beneath the same sky that had watched them both, she hoped he felt her words. She knew he had carried her memory as fiercely as she had carried his. Each heartbeat a silent promise that even in absence, love endures. The wind whispered through the cabin cracks, and she listened as if it were his voice, carrying the echo of a promise that had once filled her table and her heart. The sadness remained, a shadow woven into the threads of her life, but it was tempered by the memory of that one evening, the one man who had seen her fully, who had offered kindness when the world had turned its back, and in that remembering, she found a bittersweet solace. The understanding that some loves are not meant to last forever, but their impact can endure far longer than life itself. The candle burned low, the prairie stretched endlessly beyond the hills, and Clara closed her eyes, feeling him once more, in the quietest part of her soul, where love and sorrow intertwined, eternal as the western sky.